Hey everybody, the first Bloodborne lore video is finally here. Let me just say at the start that the hardest part of coming up with the content for these videos is that I would watch other uploaders' stuff and then feel my need drain away. As I said in my review, the story of Bloodborne has more clarity than the past Souls games, and therefore much of the information can be inarguably obtained from the people who are way ahead of me. That said, there are at least 3 videos I want to make because there's a handful of topics that I haven't heard discussed at all, as well as a handful of theories and speculative arguments that no one else has touched. For anything I end up not speaking on, I suggest taking a look at other uploaders because it means that I did not have an alternative concept to present. For this first Bloodborne lore video, I wanted to start by establishing what the world is that we are fighting in. It's not as simple as it seems. There is a real world in the game, real being a state of normality that will exist when the hunt is over, in relative comparison. You'll understand in a minute. Much of the game takes place in this near reality, the world that will be lived within when the hunt is over, by the hunters, those who were beasts, and the citizens who survived. The areas of Central Yharnam, the Cathedral Ward, Old Yharnam, the Forbidden Forest, Byrgenwerth, and even Yahar'gul are all places of reality, despite the monstrosities they are filled with throughout the game. It took some consideration to include Yahar'gul amongst this realm, because of both the kidnapping that occurs, you randomly waking up after losing to a Sackman mob, and the fact that the mobs change as time passes. However, what makes it discernibly a part of the near reality is that it is fully connected to the other parts of the world. You can exit from one of the lower dungeon portions to find Parl, with a door behind him accessing Old Yharnam, and after you defeat Rom, it is easy enough to walk right into Yahar'gul from the Cathedral Ward area. That's not to say that the world we traverse is purely reality, however. It seems pretty obvious to me that Bloodborne deals with shifting states of reality, of both different realities existing to be traversed, and alternate realities being emplaced upon another, or affecting one another. Micolash says some very peculiar things that can begin this discussion. First, a hunter is a hunter even in a dream, which he speaks as the player inflicts damage upon him. Second, new ideas of the higher plane, which strongly suggest that he is knowledgeable of a different reality. Third, when you defeat Micolash, I'm waking up now, I'll forget everything. This implies that you are not even killing him. Micolash is the host of the nightmare, and his death is seemingly only the cancellation of his existence in that nightmare. One would have thought it ended with his defeat, being the host, but the nightmare continues due to the wet nurse, the creature that watches over the nightmare. So, what is the nightmare? Is it truly just a bad dream, the ill thoughts of someone who is asleep? Or is it an alternate reality? Whose reality would it be? Whose nightmare are we in? The one creature that apparently seems to be innocently responsible for all of this. Murgo. Murgo is the child of Yharnam, the queen of a large city-mass that has apparently taken her name. This Murgo does not have a father, per the usual definition, as it was implanted into Queen Yharnam by the Great Ones. We're not to continue down that road for today, so let's instead continue on our discussion of alternate realities, and also the ability of being able to perceive them. An extremely telling thing that Micolash says is, as you once did for vacuous Rom, grant us eyes. Place eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy. But think about it. What did we actually do for Rom? We killed him, of course, and yet when we kill Micolash he is disappointed. So what's the difference? I struggled with this a lot. It's actually a part of the reason that the lore videos have taken as long as they have. At first it almost seemed as if From has made a mistake, because if Micolash wanted us to kill him, he would have not only been excited about it, he probably would have just stood there as a sacrifice. The difference became clear to me as I thought about the possibility of alternating realities. Rom you fight in the Moonside Lake. You access this reality by diving into what should have been a large lake, but instead becomes a plain on which a battle can commence. This is obviously not the reality that we know, meaning that Byrgenwerth ended up creating or discovering what was a separate reality, Likewise, to access the nightmare zones is not done by normal means of transportation. It starts by warping to the lecture hall, but even more importantly, the two doors leading to the nightmare zones, Frontier and Mensis, have a notable visual effect that occurs when you open the doors. Did you recognize it? The power of an amygdala? You are most definitely being transported to a new reality by going to each of the nightmare zones. That being the case, why would Mikolash want you to mimic the treatment of Ram and yet be disappointed in his own defeat? We have to firstly examine what the hell Ram is. He is a safeguard, placed as a guard between one reality and the next. His presence actually halts the nightmare from spreading outside of Yahar'gul, the door opening only upon his death. His existence kept the door sealed, kept the player and all hunters from having the knowledge, the insight, of seeking the source of the nightmare. Now, keeping in mind that when Mikolash is killed he complains about waking up and forgetting, not that he is killed, what did we grant Ram? It's unlikely that Ram was actually killed either. Vacuous implies that he is a mindless shell, not a creature of insight and thought, but something more akin to a golem or a sentry. He waits in an alternate reality, something that is very difficult to access, but his death allows deeper access into the nightmare. Our killing him likely freed him from his vacuous state in that alternate reality. I believe that what Mikolash wanted, what he hoped would happen, was precisely the same thing. He was hoping that his defeat would open access to a greater understanding of the nightmare, particularly because I think he and his ilk are no longer in control. In fact, I believe that while originally Yharnam, Mikolash, and others were the progenitors of the current nightmare, they became stepping stones upon Murgo's birth. I believe that the nightmare is Murgo's creation, or has become such, and that the wet nurse is his guardian, likely created by Murgo in his infantile and deformed state. His infected power, being the deformed offspring of the Great Ones, overtook the nightmare and is the world at present. The umbilical cord you retrieve from the defeat of the wet nurse states that allowed Mensis an audience with Murgo, but that this resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. Clever wording aside, I believe this ties into exactly what I am talking about. It is Murgo's nightmare, the horrible reality that has the entire world infected with beasts, and the people of Mensis, such as Mikolash, were hoping to be able to find better access to what they started. Meanwhile, what truly occurred is their loss of insight. They used the umbilical cord for Yharnam's pregnancy, and, while they were able to access the nightmare, they also became as vacuous as Ram. They may not seem it, or at least Mikolash does not, but he is most assuredly stuck where he is at, and is hoping to enlist the player's particular brand of violent help. His existence is a false one, and he wants to be allowed further insight into the nightmare. That was his intention from the start. Why, then, does his death become a disappointment? We know from his dialogue that he is leaving the nightmare reality, because he is waking up. Why does our killing him result in a different outcome than expected? I can only assume it is because of our blood, the pale blood, an interference by Gehrman. Speaking of which, the dream is yet another reality we need to discuss. The Hunter's Dream is a location that allows us to access different parts of the nightmare, while also increasing our abilities in ways that don't make sense per normality. Most importantly, it keeps us alive and without penalty upon death, as if death, true death, is not even an option. I think there is more to this than a mere game mechanic, despite its repetitious use in the previous titles. I believe that calling it the Hunter's Dream is a flashing beacon to let the other players know what they are experiencing. It is a dream world, a counter, if you will, to the nightmare. With its existence, hunters are able to participate in the hunt, seeking out beasts while maintaining a sense of the self. They are separated from the citizens of Yharnam, the beasts, and the other hunters presumably not chosen by Gehrman, or having already been chosen and failed. More on that another time. Alright, so, what is the dream in particular? Another reality, of course, one that was built beneath the Healing Church workshop. Just below it we find an abandoned workshop, eerily similar in appearance to the Hunter's Dream, including an abandoned doll. It was in this workshop that Gehrman worked on and ultimately created the dream. The strangest thing that we find here is another umbilical cord. This core description states, and this one I want to read a part of word for word: the third umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream. I consider this to be key wording because precipitated essentially means unexpectedly caused. That means that Gehrman was not originally attempting to make contact with a Great One, but that he had. It's beginning to get complicated, but let me say this, that I think he found a way around what happened with Murgo, whether by his choice or inadvertently. Queen Yharnam, Ailsifka, and Ariane are all living women, capable of corruption, including the corruption of their pregnancy. I believe that what Gehrman was attempting to do was make contact with a Great One as well, but he used a feminine doll instead of a living host. He may not have wanted to have direct contact, as we know he inevitably did, but simply to interact with their alternate realities in a safe manner. How exactly this leads to the creation of the dream and the doll functionally being alive, it may never be certain, but one thing definitely is. When you complete the game, you have 3 choices. The first is to submit to Gehrman's beheading, which causes you to wake in the real world, all memory lost of the hunt. What also occurs in this ending is that the dream is still very much intact, the still farcely living doll wishing the player success in finding their worth. I believe this is implying that the hunt was technically unsuccessful. The player has bested Murgo's nightmare and achieved what most could hope to, but it does not complete Gehrman's horrible dream. The second ending, when you refuse Gehrman's offer without eating umbilical cords, has him start by questioning what has influenced your rebellion, the hunt, the blood, or the horrible dream itself. He also states that it always comes down to him ending the hunters, suggesting that numerous times he has killed hunters who sought to rebel against his awakening. After his defeat, the moon is particularly large and red again, and the moon presence appears to consume us. We are not dead by any means after this ending, but instead being wheeled around by the doll, still within the hunter's dream. We have essentially taken Gehrman's place as the caretaker of the dream, the hunter's assistant, as he calls himself. The third ending is unique in that you first must eat 3 umbilical cords before refusing Gehrman's offer. This time when the moon presence comes for your character, you have the insight to repel his indoctrination, for lack of a better term. Insight that you gain from the consumption of 3 umbilical cords that have been used to make contact with Great Ones. The descriptions of the umbilical cords include the granting of eyes on the inside, but I don't believe this is a reference to actual organs, but instead to the knowledge inside a person's soul, allowing them to make contact with Great Ones, compete with them, and become the same as them. This is what Micolash, Ram, Willem, and Gehrman were all attempting to do, all in their own way, all helping create a different reality to be uncovered. Killing the moon presence reveals an extremely interesting choice of terms, something we saw when the wet nurse was killed, that of nightmare slain. This is proof enough that the nightmares are separate realities, and that Gehrman's nightmare is the true contact with the cosmos, the being that is actually at the top. However, the player still doesn't leave the dream upon victory, but instead becomes a slug-like creature that the doll proceeds to care for. The player has become the next spawning of a nightmare, whether that is to be called a Great One, Cosm, or something else. My interpretation of all this is that, in a vein similar enough to the Dark Souls games, there's something cyclical going on, or more like iterations of reality splicing that can never be ended. A hunter can either do well and then wake up to perhaps take up the hunt again at some point, succeed over the current assistant taking their place, or succeed over the moon presence, the contact between the realities seen in the game and the cosmos, taking its place and allowing the hunt to reform and continue into perpetuity. In other words, it seems as if the Great Ones are never to be outdone or undone. That's the end of my talk on differing realities, but there is just one other thing I wish to discuss when it comes to the world itself. It's the city of Yharnam, and how I don't believe that it is even its actual name. I believe that the main area of the game, where we spend most of our time, is not truly called Yharnam. It is called that within Murgo's nightmare, the entire world being named after one of the very few things he knows, his mother. It doesn't really make sense that the queen's name would be Yharnam, and yet so would the kingdom. If you think about the area where we find Yharnam, in the dungeons, I suggest that the kingdom's name is actually Thumaru, and we are combating against the beast-turned Thumerians. The levels of the dungeon are known as the Thumerian Labyrinth, not Thumaru itself, and as I already pointed out, Yharnam is the queen's name, and she is ruling in a part of the world not touched by the nightmares, which is called Thumaru. They are all one and the same, and the only difference, the only reason it is called Yharnam, is because Murgo is an infant given massive power.